Now, much like most of you, I've been glued to the screen this weekend watching this latest episode of the war in the Middle East unfolding in real time. Now, you may recall a video that I put out at the start of January saying pretty much the same words when the Iranian people took to the streets and they were trying to overthrow the regime. They sadly were repressed by the regime, and we've heard figures of up to 30,000 people killed during that violence and the suppression. And then simultaneously, the Americans were obviously giving out some pretty strong rhetoric in public, but then behind the scenes were doing a lot of diplomatic negotiations, trying to get the Iranians to come back from the brink, because ultimately their position, and rightly so, is that the Iranians simply cannot have a nuclear arsenal. And so now we've seen the latest iteration of this. Israel struck first, and then the United States soon afterwards. Iran then just started lashing out at anyone within its reach. And it was targeting mostly civilian populations, some military targets, but it's hit Dubai airport. It fired today 2 missiles towards the Cyprus sovereign base areas, which is where the British military is based. They were fortunately intercepted, but it's caused massive disruption to the whole region. You know, the airspace is tightening, the energy markets are reacting literally to every headline. And as always, the information space is completely flooded. We've got outrage, ideology, instant certainty. But if we want to understand what's actually happening, we have to separate the noise from the intelligence. And I've said to you before that information plus analysis equals intelligence. Without that analysis, it's just opinion. And in this context, it means listening to serious defence analysts, people who study force posture, logistics, political signalling and military feasibility. They do it for a living, day in, day out, and they've been monitoring this situation for years. Listen to these people and you can find them online, and they're super credible, super experienced, rather than the influencers that are chasing engagement, wanting to try and get their point out first. Because the key questions are, to what end and when? Because if the objective, like we saw in June last year, is to stop Iran developing the nuclear weapons, we can safely say that airstrikes alone are unlikely to achieve it. You see, the facilities are underground in hardened bunkers. They may be damaged, but it's highly unlikely that they're going to be completely eradicated. And then similarly, the knowledge that the Iranian regime holds on how to build and develop these nuclear weapons, it's not going to be bombed away. Iran has domestic uranium reserves. It has the support of Russia and China in this regard. It's got the technical expertise. Without ground forces going in and securing every single site, which is politically unthinkable after Iraq, the programme would just be rebuilt again and again, because air power delays, it very rarely eradicates. Now, on the other hand, if the objective is regime change, well, still, history is just as sobering, because air campaigns alone do not topple entrenched regimes. Without boots on the ground or a civil uprising, internal fractures, decisive political transformation is highly unlikely, because that leaves hope. Hope, that the Iranian people will rise up, that they'll seize the opportunity. And we've heard, President Trump calling to this. Hope that the IRGC change sides and join with the people and overthrow the regime. It could happen, but it's a big if. Hope is not a strategy. And on top of this, timing matters really significantly as well, because, the escalation in this instance, it occurred on a Friday evening, and that's after the markets have closed, because it limits the immediate financial repercussions. We've got oil flowing through the Straits of Hormuz. It's already being targeted. Now you're seeing on social media, tankers ablaze, because they know it's a strategic choke point for the global trade system. And any disruption to it is just going to create chaos across the whole world. And it's proper strategic leverage that the Iranians have got. After the strikes began, we saw President Donald Trump address not only his own people, but also the Iranian people as well, directly urging them, as I mentioned before, to take control of their destiny, to seize this opportunity that's probably a once-in-a-generation chance for them to finally overthrow this hated regime. And what's more important is it's really revealing that he is acknowledging that the bombs and the Tomahawk missiles and the B-2s and all of the air power that's there, they alone cannot achieve either of those two objectives. It also, for President Trump, creates a political off-ramp for him. You see, because if the regime falls, he can take the credit. It's validation of what we've done. If it survives, the responsibility shifts. It shifts away from him and the Israelis towards the Iranian people because they didn't seize the opportunity quick enough, or they didn't, rise up soon enough, etc. And we've seen at the same time there's a bit of duality with President Trump's rhetoric and also that of Reza Pahlavi, and he's the son of the deposed Shah of Iran. He's been issuing statements basically in this leadership position, encouraging the people of Iran to prepare for this moment of transition, but also saying, do not do anything until I exactly tell you to go. But this in itself raises a pretty obvious question. He's been living in exile for a significant part of his life. Would he be seen as a legitimate national figure or as a Western-backed installation? Because the United States and Britain and many other Western intelligence services have got a long history of influencing leadership, outcomes, and that memory is not just going to have disappeared. You'd have to see whether or not the Iranian people actually judged him to be the correct heir to the throne. But whilst all of this strategic chessboard's unfolding, there's another reality which really bothers me, and it's playing out in the West. We've got this highly vocal pro-Palestine activist movement, and they struggle with this glaring inaccuracy and this massive contradiction. They're accusing Israel of genocide when it responds to these Iranian-backed proxies. And you see them literally on, I think it was October the 7th, the same day of the attacks, they were already protesting in the streets of London. How did they organise so quickly? How did they manage to achieve that? How did they have so much outrage whilst, Israeli people were still in the process of being brutally murdered by these Iranian-backed rebels? They mobilised instantly and demanded all of this moral clarity. Yet, when the Islamic Republic suppresses protests, kills up to 30,000 of its people, imprisons dissidents, is literally executing people on the streets, what did we hear? Because if they truly cared about oppressed people, that switch would not be able to be turned on and off depending on whether it fitted their political narrative. The Iranian people are not symbols in someone else's ideological struggle. They're living under an Islamic regime that prioritises its ideological dominance over any sort of freedom of its own people. And yet, in parts of the United Kingdom and the wider West, some of these activists condemn Israel's right to self-defence against these Iranian proxies, whilst at the exact same time, and we've just seen it in Denton and Gorton in the by-election, promoting political Islam at home in our country, despite the clear evidence of how a fully entrenched Islamist regime behaves when it holds power. This isn't about private faith, it's about political ideology, and we've done videos on how Islam fuses both the religious and also the political into one big system. It can't be separated. But all of a sudden, it's got state authority. The Islamic Republic does not operate on any sort of Western liberal pluralism. It does not tolerate any sort of sustained dissent. Regionally and domestically, its conduct reflects a priority simply of power and control. Now, you cannot claim, and this is to the people in the United Kingdom, these absolute traitors, you cannot claim to stand for universal human rights whilst ignoring that glaring reality. But I think that contradiction, that confusion is part of this noise that we can see in this massively congested space. The real intelligence lies in capability, incentives, and historical precedent. What is actually achievable militarily? What risks this escalation across the whole region or even wider? What pressures on the global energy system will occur? And also, what uprising or internal fractures are actually realistic? Because what we're likely seeing right now from Israel and from the United States is a phase of punitive strikes designed to demonstrate the resolve of President Trump and the Israelis rather than actually achieve any decisive transformation. It may cause the people to rise up. It may cause the Iranian security services to turn against the regime, but Iran is highly likely, despite how many of its heads of snakes, are killed, it's highly likely to respond asymmetrically, and that's missiles, drones, pressure on these regional bases, attacks on shipping, attacks on, tourist destinations, attacks on places outside of the region where they think that Western influence exists. And each side's going to continuously claim victory, but unless this is resolved now, the structural issues will continue to remain. But if we want to understand this looming regional conflict, we've got to reject the simplistic narratives. War doesn't begin with hashtags. It begins with, as I said to you right at the beginning, these force build-ups, logistics chains, political calculations, and also that historical memory. So whilst you're going to hear lots and lots of these activists shouting and the government's posturing, ordinary Israelis, ordinary Iranians, ordinary Palestinians, ordinary people across the whole world will always carry the consequences. So before amplifying any outrage, we should ask, what's actually achievable? Who benefits from this escalation? Who pays the price? And are we, the observers, responding to proper intelligence or just simply the noise?